So in hindsight, I probably should have made this theory a while ago, but for some reason I always wait until making a theory until its time has passed and then wait for the next thing to come out and the cycle continues, but I digress. So in the Kingdom Hearts Union Cross update we got last December, we learned a lot about the mysterious entity called Darkness. We learned that Darkness can feel people's emotions and can act accordingly to how they feel. That's the reason Ventus ended up killing Strelitzia, because it was Darkness that sensed how badly Ventus wanted power and essentially gave him the tools to get what he wanted. And Darkness then of course took over his body, killed Strelitzia, changed into Ava, and called it a day. We also learned that Darkness was there when the Book of Prophecies was written, which in itself is really interesting because that would mean they know everything that is meant to happen in the future, and I'll probably explore that in a later video. But what I want to focus on today is actually Darkness and how there are supposed to be multiple Darknesses. Because in the update, Darkness said that there were more of them than there are of light, and I think that little piece of information could have opened up the doors to a new theory and some possible new information about the Foretellers, Luxu, and the Master of Masters. So that being said, let's dive into this theory about the Darkness. So as I said earlier, Darkness said that there were more of them than there are of light, meaning that there are of course multiple Darknesses, and that could end up to eluding what Nomura has done before in this series, and it could be another version of the 13 Darknesses and the 7 Lights, which would again of course be no stranger to this series. Honestly, it wouldn't surprise me if it came back again in this different context. But what interests me is actually what Darkness said when it was talking to Brain. Darkness reveals that the Master of Masters and Darkness are old friends, which means they might have met in some capacity before. And honestly, that in itself gives a bit more credibility to the theory that the Master of Masters' true name is Light. Because since there are beings that are essentially pure darkness, it would make sense that there are beings of pure light as well, but we're not here to talk about that. So from an earlier update, I think it was probably October of 2020, we know that the Master of Masters does have a plan to defeat the darkness. So if the premise that we're essentially going back to the whole 13 Darknesses against 7 Lights ends up being true, we already know who the 13 Darknesses are. But that leaves the question of who are the 7 Lights? Who would be the 7 people to stand up against the Darknesses? And I know there are a lot of people who believe that it could be the Guardians of Light, and it very well could be our heroes who end up defeating the main antagonists in the end. But there's a part of me that believes that should the battle of the 13 Darknesses and the 7 Lights make a comeback in future games, the 7 Lights that could end up fighting against the 13 Darknesses could actually end up being the Foretellers, Luxu, and the Master of Masters themselves. Because, like I said earlier, the Master of Masters does have a plan to defeat the darkness. And honestly, that plan could easily involve the Foretellers, since I doubt he went to all the trouble of training up 6 Keyblade Masters only to use them to incite a Keyblade War. Maybe he could have, but he could have also trained them to have a bigger purpose. You know, they could be the ones to end up helping him defeat the darkness. The reason Luxu could have summoned them back is because now that darkness seems to be in the current timeline by residing within Ventus, they have to summon the Master of Masters back to continue the plan to defeat the darkness. And I know what you're thinking, the main thing against this theory would be the placement of their chess pieces as shown in the ending of Kingdom Hearts 3. But to that I say, remember, these chess pieces don't decide light and darkness, they really only set up things in their relation to Sora. Like at the end of the day, in Kingdom Hearts 3, Xehanort ended up fighting Sora, but he had good intentions even if he resorted to darker methods to see them through. Because there were more than a couple of members on the real Organization 13 that weren't necessarily evil, they were just fighting on the side of darkness. And that of course can be changed with characters like Riku. And that could be the same case here. I mentioned earlier that the 7 of them could be back in this timeline to continue the plan to defeat the darkness, so what that plan could include is something that involves sacrifice, and knowing Sora, he could just not want to take that sitting down, which could end up being how Sora sees them as antagonists. Now, I made a video a while back with a theory that basically said the Foretellers could actually not be evil, and another one that was basically saying that the Master of Masters could also not be evil, so I guess this is really just an update to both of those theories that reflect the new information we got in the recent Union Cross update. But in any case, having the Master of Masters and his students being the one to fight and possibly defeat the darknesses wouldn't be too out of the question. Because again, I know people like Luxu and the Master of Masters have done some pretty terrible things. You know, the Master of Masters is definitely the worst of the two. The man incited a Keyblade war that killed hundreds if not thousands of young Keyblade wielders in the age of fairy tales. And Luxu, while he hasn't done anything that terrible, he has fought and tried to defeat Sora on several occasions. So I know a lot of people think that that essentially rules them out for being the ones to fight the darkness, but you gotta remember, there are people like Axel and Riku. While they were fighting on the side of light in Kingdom Hearts 3, they also did some pretty bad things in their day. Riku essentially allowed his heart to be taken over by Ansem, Seeker of Darkness, and Axel, we didn't forget what you did to Vexen. So saying that the Foretellers, Luxu, and the Master of Masters could end up being the ones to face the capital D darkness wouldn't be too far out of the realm of possibility, because we've seen before that people have the capacity to change and end up fighting on the side of light. I do think the Foretellers and our main cast will end up fighting each other at some point though, because while the chessboard doesn't exactly tell the whole story, I think it's safe to assume that they will be antagonists to our main cast at some point in the future. But in that same breath, like I mentioned in the theory about the Foretellers, I don't think they're necessarily evil. Heck, part of me believes that the Master of Masters isn't entirely evil, even though he's done some things that definitely fit into that category. But I think the story has showed us and explained to us several times that there is more to darkness and light than just good and evil, and I think that could be the case even with characters like the Master of Masters. And in the case of the Foretellers, they really haven't shown any indication of them being evil, so it'd be hard to believe that they're the true antagonists of Phase 2 when we know that darkness exists and, as far as we know, has yet to be dealt with. If anything, the Foretellers seem like the best people out of that group, because while they were misled and the Master intentionally caused discord in their group, as people they seem to be on the side of light at the end of the day. There's nothing we've seen to make me believe that they would suddenly just become evil and give in to the darkness. So what I think could actually happen is that they could end up being antagonists at some point. I just don't think they'll end up being the final bosses of the Kingdom Hearts series. What could possibly happen is that Sora ends up clashing with the Foretellers, and it's after that he learns about darkness and how they're true enemies. Or maybe he could end up talking with Luxu or even the Master of Masters himself. Either way, call it a hunch or more of a theorist's intuition, but I do think that the key to defeating darkness might not lie with Sora or any of our main cast, but it could actually lie with the Foretellers, Luxu, and the Master of Masters. But enough about me, what do you guys think? Do you think that the Master of Masters and his students will end up fighting the darkness, or do you think they are actually the main antagonists of Phase 2? Let me know down below. And if you want to see more JRPG related content of games like Kingdom Hearts and Persona, do me a favor and support the channel by hitting that red little subscribe button. And finally, if you want to become a member of the community, make sure you join the community Discord, which will be down below in the description. But that's going to be all from me today, so this is Moose Wayne, signing off.